Good morning all, and thank you for joining us. The webinar will start shortly. Good morning all. Welcome to today's seminar. My name's Kath Crowther and I'm the Regional Director for the CLA in the East, and I will be the chair for today. Before I introduce our speakers, can I please remind you of the information which is available on the CLA website? We're very aware of the impact that coronavirus has had on you and your businesses. There have been far-reaching consequences of the government lockdown, and now we're having to decipher the new advice as restrictions are gradually lifted. As well as generic information at cla.org.uk/coronavirus, there are a range of specific guidance notes written for members available on the website, where you can log on by My CLA. We're also in the process of producing operational guidance for members around reopening, alongside our work pushing for the restart of the rural economy. Can I also remind you, please, that members get free advice, so do get in contact with your regional office if there's anything at all we can help you with. It's what we're here for. And also, those inquiries are very helpful in feeding into our lobbying work, and it's been able to help us with the various meetings we've been having with different government departments, and it helps us to establish a lobbying position on different matters. Whilst COVID has taken up a huge amount of our time over the last few months, we've also been working very hard for you on other topics. Sadly, the rain didn't arrive yesterday in Cambridgeshire, but the CLA water strategy, which we're currently developing, and the soon-to-be published CLA reservoir handbook will be welcomed by many. Future of farming and future support mechanisms are high on the agenda. The Ag Bill has now passed through the House of Commons and is in the House of Lords, with its second reading next week. We've been briefing peers on proposed amendments ahead of that, and we continue to push for a 12-month delay in the reduction of direct payments. The Trade Bill and Environment Bill will follow, and again, we've been providing briefings in anticipation for those. There's lots of focus on trees over the last year, and so today's webinar will explain a little bit about the opportunities that trees present for land managers, the funding mechanisms available, and some of the management issues and considerations. Can I please thank our partners, Stratton Parker and Barclays, both of whom are presenting today. I should remind you that today's session is being recorded, for the future, and will be available to members on the CLA website. The format for today's event is that each speaker will present. Please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A panel. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. Please restrict your questions to the session, the subject matter. Otherwise, please approach your CLA regional office. The lineup today will start with Carl McConville from Barclays. He will talk a bit about why now might be the time to invest in forestry. Graham Clark, the CLA Senior Land Use and Policy Advisor for Forestry, Woodlands and Energy, will give a CLA policy update and talk through the carbon market and the carbon guarantee scheme, as well as other funding available. Ollie Thompson from John Clegg & Co, which is the forestry division of Stratton Parker, will talk through forestry and timber markets, pests and diseases, as well as tree safety. We also work very closely with the Forestry Commission, and Alistair Boston, the Deer Officer at the Forestry Commission, who is one of the attendees on today's webinar, has said that he is happy to speak to members about deer issues. Graham can put you in touch if there is anything you would like to talk to him about. Now I would like to pass you on to Carl for his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath. So the other two speakers are very much forestry experts. My name's Carl McConville and I head up landed estates at Barclays. So I'm going to keep this brief and very much sort of set the scene, hopefully, for the other two speakers. Landed estates have always had a distinct entity. They've had a distinct place in the landscape, and part of that has been forestry. Within the last 150 years, we've seen a significant reduction in the areas of forestry in parts of the country for all the right reasons. We've seen forestry come out of production so that we can feed the nation and focus on food production and farming. And that has been to the detriment in some ways to estates and how they look and how they feel and how they operate. Now we have an opportunity, which I'll come to in a moment, to put that right and to reinvent these estates and to bring them back into the type of business that they used to be, in terms of their visual appearance, their help into the nature and everything else, and to provide a legacy. Forestry has always been there to provide a legacy, to provide a long-term investment for landowners. So why now? As I said earlier, estates have fed the nation. And now is the time where we have more food than we've had in a long while, that some of this land can be set aside for a longer period. We have a climate target to achieve, and estates and forestry will be a significant part of that. Opportunities are coming around the corner, and Graham and Ollie will talk far more about that and where they fit in and how they work. But carbon capture will be the future of our landed estates and will be a significant income line going forward. At this time of COVID crisis, a lot of us are looking at our businesses and thinking, leisure and tourism has been great over the past few years. Will it be part of the future? I believe it will. And actually having a diversified estate and one with forestry and areas of woodland allows for different types of activity to occur within estates and makes them, I believe, far more future-proofed. Ecology and biodiversity, without a doubt, the watchwords of today. We're seeing biodiversity offsetting as part of housing, and I think next week's CLA webinar is on planning, and I dare say biodiversity offsetting will come in as part of that. But woodland and biodiversity and ecology within estates is going to be a part of that, and we can play our part. But why now? Obviously, we've got all these great reasons, but in a low interest rate environment, which as a banker you would expect me to talk about, it's a great time to think about how you can make your cash work over a longer period. It's relatively tax efficient, and it's a relatively good long-term investment with an opportunity to pass assets between generations and to help the next generation along. So that's really all I wanted to say today. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about investment in forestry and how the banks can help. But without further ado, I'll hand on to the experts, and Graham Clark at the CLA is coming on next. Thank you, Graham.
Well, thanks, Carol. I'm Graham Clark, Senior Land Use Policy Advisor at the CLA, and I'm glad to see so many participating this morning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a policy update and some of the funding opportunities that we've got. So I'll just get myself set up here. Okay, right. We've got a fair amount to cover in a relatively short space of time. So I'll cover policy developments, recent ones. One of those is the DEFRA tree strategy, which we're expecting for consultation quite soon. So I'll cover some recommendations from CLA on that. I'll then run through the different funding schemes for woodlands that are in play at the moment, and finish up with some comments on the carbon market and some of the schemes that are in that space. Most of what I'll say will cover England, but there are some key differences between England and Wales, and I'll try and highlight those as we go along. Okay, so policy. One of the overarching things that affects the forestry world at the moment is the net zero commitment that the government have made. That's now in law. There's no hiding place for the government on that now. They need a net zero economy by 2050. And there's really no way that that can be achieved through decarbonisation alone across the economy. That's the main way they'll achieve it. But tree planting and carbon offsetting and that sort of approach is a key part of how we're going to get there. And with that in mind, the Committee on Climate Change, which is the government advisory body for all of that, have recommended that the UK needs to plant at least 30,000 hectares of new woodland and trees every year between now and 2050. That's every year, so it's quite a tall order. They also say that we need to manage more of our woodlands, and they would like 80% of our native woods to be brought into more active management to UK forestry standards. And they're also recommending that agroforestry solutions are part of the solution as well. There's been no substantive response to that latest January this year report by the Committee on Climate Change from the government. Although at the budget a few months ago, they did say in the spring that they were going to bring forward a Nature for Climate Fund with £640 million behind it. There's not a lot of detail on that yet, other than they've said that it will protect, restore and expand our woodlands, but there's really not much flesh on the bones yet. They did, however, mention the 30,000 hectare target for tree planting, although what they did actually say was that they will commit to that in England by 2024, which is 4 years, and 30,000 divided by 4 years is about 6,000 a year. So it's well short of what the Committee on Climate Change are saying that we need to be achieving. So we need some significant ramping up there. The tree strategy I've already mentioned in England, that will come out for consultation in a couple of weeks, we're expecting. There is one in Wales already, but I suspect that that might need to be revised or at least refreshed in the light of Brexit and the Committee on Climate Change recommendations. So this graph here tells us how we've been doing in terms of tree planting over the last few decades, and you'll see that there's a sort of steady downward decline since the late 80s, and last year we planted about 13,500 hectares across the UK. Most of that was in Scotland. There was about 1,500 hectares or so in England and a few hundred in Wales, and well short of where we need to be. The last time we were achieving the kind of planting targets that the CCC are recommending was the late 80s, when the tax regime was quite different and very favourable to forestry at that time. So it's quite a tall order. So other things on policy before I move on to funding are the Agriculture Bill, which was mentioned in the introduction. That's continuing its way through Parliament. The Environment Bill will come after it. Some quite far-reaching changes that will result from that. They'll phase out direct farm payments, and that will be replaced with a model to pay farmers and landowners for the provision of public goods. The main mechanism in England so far that we will implement that is the DEFRA Environmental Land Management Scheme, which they're currently designing and putting together at the moment. There's a similar one in development in Wales, the Sustainable Land Management approach. The one in England is envisaged by DEFRA to have 3 tiers, a widely available tier 1 focusing on sustainable farming and forestry, although to be honest, with the detail that's in play at the moment, there's very little on woodland in that. They envisage woodland management and smaller scale woodland creation to be in tier 2, which would be a targeted tier rather than a widely available to all tier. And similarly, tier 3 would be targeted, and that would be for more fundamental land use change, landscape scale change, collaboration between farmers and landowners, where larger scale woodland creation could take place. That's broadly DEFRA's thinking, and the scheme wouldn't be widely available for another 3 or 4 years. But a couple of issues that certainly CLA have felt with what's in play at the moment is that woodland management, if we want to reach more woodlands and get them into management, we perhaps need that to be in tier 1 rather than tier 2, where it's going to be more restricted. And woodland creation at scale. If we're going to be doing the kinds of planting that is envisaged, then that's going to cost a lot of money. Maybe we need a bespoke, a particular scheme for woodland creation at scale rather than doing it through ELM. ELM could do some of it, but maybe we need another one on top of that. So in terms of the tree strategy, some of the key recommendations, I'm not going to go through all of them because we've got quite a lot of them. But our broad vision from the CLA's point of view is for woodland to be an attractive land use choice, and that would cover everything from small farm woodlands, agroforestry, right up to large-scale commercial forestry. We need all of that. Our recommendations there's quite a few of them. I'll pull out a few and mention them this morning, but broadly they fit into 3 categories: governance and regulation, sustainable forestry management and markets, and getting the incentives right. We feel that the Forestry Commission really does need to be retained as the lead body in all of this, but it needs to be ambitiously resourced in line with these ambitious tree planting targets. It's going to generate an awful lot of work, and I think the Forestry Commission need to be geared up in order to be able to deal with that. The Forestry Act governs a lot of what we do in forestry, and there's a presumption of the retention of woodland cover, and that's for very good reasons, and we wouldn't want that to be done away with. Although in certain circumstances it might need finessing. It could be acting as a barrier to the creation of woodlands, perhaps at smaller scale on farms. That might need a wee bit of re-looking at. Commercial softwood, that needs to be a key part of what our strategy in England and Wales, I would say, alongside native planting. Other things that we have recommended is we need to incentivise trees on farms, as I've said, develop a woodland economy. The nursery sector needs some support to enable it to scale up to meet the task of planting all these trees. We need to invest in skills and accredited advice provision for woodland creation and management and all the opportunities there. We need to continue research to improve our climate resilience. Big issue, we're in a changing climate. The trees that we planted years ago aren't necessarily going to do well in the future. We need to tackle pests and diseases, so we need measures to tackle those and to help landowners and managers cope with that. We need a whole range of different incentives for woodland, as I've said, and perhaps a specific scheme for forestry, and also a tax regime that facilitates all of this. We'll get many more, but I'll leave it at that anyway. In terms of the current funding scheme, the picture for woodland is quite complex. The Countryside Stewardship Scheme in England is one of the main sources, and there's several strands of that through stewardship. You can create woodlands, the Woodland Creation Grant, and that's a 3 hectare and above scheme, mainly for native woodland planting. You can apply at any time, and there's a grant of up to nearly £7,000 a hectare for the stock and the protection, fencing, that sort of thing. There's a related maintenance payment of a couple of £100 per hectare per year to manage those new woods through the higher tier scheme. The management planning grant is a one-off payment to create a management plan for woodlands, and the payments there are geared according to size, as I've indicated on the slide. And for existing woodlands, there's a woodland improvement grant. It's relatively small amounts of money, £100 a hectare for 5 years. That's through the higher tier, and that's for improving the biodiversity or resilience of woodlands. There's also restocking grants through the Woodland Tree Health strand, with the payments geared according to whether you're dealing with ancient woodland sites or not, and whether we're replanting and restocking with native species or not. So that's the stewardship side of things. There's a parallel system of incentives in Wales called Glasteer, which broadly speaking deals with similar things: woodland creation, management and restoration. But at larger scales, the Forestry Commission offer a woodland creation grant called the Woodland Carbon Fund, and that's for productive timber bearing species and woods of more than 10 hectares in area. And you can get funding, similar rates of funding, 6,800 per hectare up to for the stock and protection. And you can also get forest roads part funded through that scheme as well. The payments can be slightly higher in near urban areas if there's public access is agreed to. So that's worth bearing in mind. So the Woodland Carbon Fund through Forestry Commission is for larger woodlands. The Woodland Trust as well, they've got a scheme for small woods, and they're very well worth bearing in mind if you're only wanting to plant a few trees or a small woodland. It's relatively unbureaucratic, so it's well worth bearing the Woodland Trust in mind too. The woodland carbon market, we've heard quite a lot about in recent months. Carbon that's locked up in new woodland and woodland soils is now a tradable entity. And the buyers in that market are businesses who want to or need to offset their emissions. And the sellers can be you guys, land managers, landowners who can plant some new woodland. And that market is likely to grow now, I would think, over the longer term, now that net zero is enshrined into law and is cutting across all areas of government policy. The Woodland Carbon Code is a voluntary standard for woodland creation where claims are made about its carbon sequestration ability. And that's a voluntary code that standardizes and brings consistency to what could be a very sort of complex situation. So there is the Woodland Carbon Code there that nails a lot of this stuff down. And in terms of the carbon price for woodland carbon, well, generally in recent years, it's been relatively small figures of broadly £5 to £15 per tonne of CO2 sequestered. But in recent years, and I'll come on to this in the next slide, the price has come up in a recent government auction earlier on this year to £25, £30 per tonne. So that brings me on to two funding sources of the carbon market. One is the Woodland Carbon Code, which is, as well as being the voluntary standard to which you would regulate and the claims made in terms of carbon sequestration of any woodland creation that you do. It also acts as a bit of a marketplace. So buyers can view, or rather sellers of carbon, those who've planted woodland, can register with the Woodland Carbon Code, and those who want to buy it can get in touch with those that carbon for sale through the Woodland Carbon Code website. The Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme is a recent scheme based on reverse auctions, and that operates in England only. The Woodland Carbon Code is UK-wide, but the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme is England only for the moment. And under that scheme, landowners can bid to create woodland at a price on their land that works for them. And they make bids based on so much per sequestered tonne of carbon. And if they're successful in one of those auctions, then they can secure a 35-year contract from the government, and they will guarantee to buy those carbon units at the agreed price every 5 or 10 years. And the beauty of the scheme is that if the market price is better, the woodland carbon can be sold on the open market at any time. Those auctions are every 6 months. There's been one already, which, as I said earlier on, reached an average price of about £24 per tonne of carbon in that first auction in January. The second one starts next week. There'll be another one in 6 months. If that's news to you, it's well worth looking at. So, woodland carbon, is it an opportunity? Well, I think it definitely is. If you're thinking of woodland creation on your land, this is well worth looking at. It brings cash flow through the life of the wood, which, as we all know, planting woodland's an expensive business. Most of the costs come at the beginning, and most of the income comes perhaps decades later, maybe not even in the person who's planted its lifetime. So it's well worth thinking about. A new native woodland, just to give you an idea of how much carbon a woodland would capture, a new native woodland typically would capture 400 to 500 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare over 100 years, say, of a woodland's life. So 400 tonnes per hectare at £25 a tonne gives you a £10,000 income over 100 years. Divided by 100 gives you about £100 a year. So in itself, not big money. So this only really stacks up if you can get access to an establishment grant in the first place, either through stewardship or through the Forestry Commission or some other, whatever schemes come later. But if you can get one of those establishment grants, then the carbon income is very well worth having. And if you can sell it on the open market or to the government, the open market might be able to pay you up front for the promised carbon once the woodland's established. So it does become an option on marginal land. So well worth considering. Just to sum up then, actually, before I go any further, there might be a slide on this later on, I think, but I recently did a guidance note in the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme for CLA members. So if you are a member, you can look at that straight away. If you're not a member, then maybe you could consider joining. You'll be able to use that guidance note and any other ones that we have. So just to sum up, the England Tree Strategy, watch out for that. That's coming out soon. The ELM scheme, DEFRA's Environmental Land Management Scheme, will come up over the next few years. They're currently consulting on it, and that's in development, so I would keep an eye out for that. As far as funding opportunities right now or in the near future, keep an eye open for grant scheme application windows. They open, they close. Some of them are open all the time, but not others. And the carbon market, keep an eye on that. There's 6 monthly Woodland Carbon Guarantee auctions, so keep an eye out for that as well. And finally, there's a link to our guidance note on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme. So that's most of what I've got to say. We made it. I'm going to hand over now to the next speaker, which is Ollie Thompson, who is Associate Director at John Clegg and Company, who are the Forestry Division of Strutton Parker. Ollie.
Graham, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about three different do apologise. That's me. I'm going to be talking about three different subjects this morning, sorry. Forestry, pest and diseases, tree safety surveys, and forest and woodland market and timber markets update. So pests and diseases, really, it could also be seen as what's killing my trees. Now, we can split this down into mammals, insects, and pathogens. Just touching on mammals, we have all sorts of mammals that are going to kill trees and going to damage your restocks or your young planted areas, all the way through from voles to rabbits and hares, squirrels, and deer. I'd just like to touch on deer control. Really, the two important takeaway messages for deer control, especially with large herding species such as red and fallow deer, the deer control needs to be on a landscape scale rather than just individual landowners. And if you're really needing to control and suppress numbers, the main focus has got to be on the breeding female population and during the winter. Now, I appreciate that this can cause issues with game shooting and pheasant shoots, but this is the only way to get on top of the populations. You can carry on taking out trophy bucks and stags. However, this really is very much a drop in the ocean. So with our mammal pests, if you don't know what is eating your trees, really you've just got to do a bit of detective work. You need to look at some of the signs that are left either on the trees that have been damaged or surrounding them. You need to look to see what has been eaten or nibbled. You need to see whether it's the bark, the stem, is it the leaves. You need to look at what footprints or hoof prints you can find in the soil and what droppings or other signs are there or thereabouts. So with regards to mammals, what can you do about them? You've really got three options. You've got the main, which is lethal control. You can also use fencing. However, this is very costly, and with fenced areas, all it takes is one breach to the fence, whether it's through somebody leaving a gate open, vandalism, or a row or a muntjac pushing underneath, and the fence is made next to useless. You can protect the trees with tree shelters. This does give a very good growing environment for young trees and will offer protection for the first 5 to 10 years. However, you will have an added cost further down the line of removing the tree shelters, which will also, at the moment, will cause plastic waste. Okay, going on to airborne pathogens. These are usually fungi, but not always. And I'm just going to touch on three main and significant ones. One we've already had asked on the Q&A about ash dieback. We've got Phytophthora ramorum, and we've also got Dothystroma septosporum, or red band needle blight. Ash dieback originally came over from Central Europe on infected planting stock, and is now widespread throughout England and Wales, and also in certain parts of Scotland. Main symptoms are wilting of the leaves of the not long after flush, and also dark brown lesions which start at the branch or other infection point and move into the stem. Unfortunately, there is very little or no control or management you can have with this disease, apart from in young ash plantations trying to keep them regularly thinned every 10 to 12 years and try and increase the airflow. But other than that, you've got very little else you can do. Phytophthora ramorum on larch. This has had a significant effect on one of the main timber producing species in Britain. It's concentrated on a slightly wetter area up the west coast and large areas of Wales, and now into southwest Scotland. Symptoms and significance. Well, really the symptoms are the dying and dieback of needles and fresh shoots, and you also have lesions similar to ash dieback on the stem and into the on the branches and into the stem, which causes significant stem bleeds. Ultimately, within one growing season, the trees are killed. They will die off, usually from the top down. And this is a notifiable disease. So if you have larch and it looks like it's dying throughout the summer season, this needs to be reported to the Forestry Commission or Forest Research. Management and control, once again, it's very difficult to manage, and the only control is through sanitation, felling. And if you are found to have Phytophthora, you will be made to fell either infected trees or infected areas. Okay, next slide. The other one, affected commercial conifers, is red band needle blight. This affects two main species of pine in the UK, lodgepole pine and Corsican pine. There is some evidence that it can affect our native Scots pine, but to a much lesser degree. And what this disease does is it defoliates, so it makes the pine trees drop their needles, and as they have a significantly reduced amount of needles, they aren't able to photosynthesize as much, and hence the growth rate significantly drops. In some cases, the trees do die, but usually you just see a reduction in growth rate. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Now I'm just going to give a slight forest and woodland update. A lot of these points will be similar across England, Scotland, and Wales, but I'll try and break them out for you. In Scotland and also northern England, with the large commercial forests, we have seen some new entrants and not the usual suspects bidding very strongly on large forests. These are typically funds or pension funds, and they've been beating the main investors who we've seen over the last several decades, who have often dominated the large commercial market. There seems to be very little fall in interest due to COVID-19, which we would have expected over the last 3 or 4 months. We have had the odd forest sale collapse or buyers pull out due to COVID-19 reasons, but this has really been the exception rather than the rule. We've found that as well as new entrants coming into the market, we've had some very strong bids on some very large woodlands and properties. Now, this is typically, strong bidding has typically been when timber prices are very high and the value of the land has been made up of the forest has been made up of the land itself, but also for the timber prices. However, recent biddings have gone that extra mile, and we're starting to feel that natural capital has become a third part in this forest valuation. Timber prices across England, Wales and Scotland are all recovering after the peak about 18 months ago. Timber prices then slumped and started to make a downturn again through the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the timber prices across the board are starting to move up. Saw log prices are steady, but they're not moving up anywhere near they were 18 months ago. Wood chips and biomass are very slow, but that's to do with a mild spring, and towards the end of the year and into the winter, that will almost certainly pick up. Two forestry products that are selling very well, both the bar, which they make pallets out of, and also fencing products are very strong at the moment. In England, the forest sales have been very similar to Scotland for the large commercial areas. We have seen some of the smaller broadleaf and amenity woodlands, whilst they're still coming to the market and they are still being sold, the sale process has started to slow down, but we think primarily that's been due to the travel restrictions and lockdown, and people just haven't been able to get out to view the woodlands. And we're also finding sales are taking slightly longer to complete. However, over in Wales, the commercial woodlands very similar to Scotland. These are still being brought to market and selling very much as usual, albeit with some of the COVID-19 issues that we've seen in the larger properties in Scotland. However, the values really haven't taken any kind of a tumble and still remain strong and climbing. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly skip through tree safety surveys. First thing we need to think about is, why should we worry about tree safety? Well, trees are living creatures or living organisms, and they are prone to failure through biotic or abiotic damage, whether it be beetle attack, wind damage, or other factors such as old age. Now, what we need to worry about is when the trees fail, if they are within any kind of risk zone of people or property, they can lead to damage, injury, or death. So who's responsible for the trees? Well, it's going to be the owner or the land occupier, whether it be a management company or other. And they have a duty of care. They have a duty of care to make sure that the trees within this ownership are not likely to cause any damage, injury to others. Now, if these trees are in the middle of a field or middle of a woodland and there is no target, there is nobody going to get hurt, then there's no issue. However, if trees in a medium to high risk area do fail and do cause injury or damage, then the landowner may be deemed negligent under common law if they haven't done anything or put anything reasonable in place to monitor the trees and rectify any issues. Next slide, please. So with the tree safety surveys, who should carry them out? Well, it should be a competent person, a professional. What is a professional? Well, really, it needs to be somebody who has the relevant knowledge, experience in surveying. Now, the benchmark or the nationally recognised qualification is the LANTRA Level 3 Professional Tree Inspection, which is really your first starting point. However, others with sufficient knowledge and experience could still be suitable. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what do the tree safety surveys need to cover? They need to cover any area where, if the tree fails, somebody or property might be damaged. Usually, these are using the VTA or the visual tree inspection method, where the tree is inspected on foot at ground level and any defects and recommendations are recorded. And different areas are put into different risk zones. So trees along busy roads or near buildings or primary schools or schools will be classed as high risk. However, parkland trees or those along a very quiet country lane may be deemed medium or low risk. Okay, next slide, please. What's next? Once you get the results, the results need to be interpreted, and you must remember that the survey alone isn't sufficient. You need to carry out the remedial work that is advised from that survey. And with regarding resurveys, every estate or land is going to be different, but as a rule of thumb, every 3 to 5 years, each area needs to be resurveyed. Next slide, please. Okay, and only any other factors to consider would be, which might affect your resurvey schedule, would be storm damage, pests and diseases, and other things such as fire and vandalism. And thank you all for listening.
Great, thanks, Ollie. If I could ask all of the presenters to turn on their videos and to keep themselves muted until we direct a question to them. We've had lots of questions coming through on the Q&A panel. Please do keep on sending those through, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So I have a question here regarding the income, annual income. So one for Graham, I think. On permanent pasture, I get a regular return for the grass, hay, grazing, meat, etc. But I get nothing from forestry, which is a crop life of over 30 years. What about some annual subsidy to compensate? Unless something is done, we will continue to fall way behind our planting targets for years to come. Now, I think that, Graham, you've partly covered that with the option of the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Code. But another question on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Code is what management is required for forestry established under that scheme?
Well, it's very much up to the landowner and what species mix they decide to put in. Different species are going to sequester, they grow at different rates. That's the key thing, is the growth rate of different types of tree varies. So you get slower growing hardwoods, faster growing conifer species like Sitka, etc. The species mix that you plant will sequester X amount of tons, and the carbon code allows you to calculate that. It's not absolutely precise. This is just best estimates, I think. But the management regime that you have is up to you. And if you have a thinning regime or a clear felling regime at the end, then that is going to remove a lot of the net carbon sequestration. If you do a clear fell, it's going to be proportionately less, but the carbon code accommodates that. So it's very much horses for courses. There isn't a prescribed management regime under the Woodland Carbon Code or the guarantee scheme.
Thanks, Graham. One here, I think, for Ollie. Being a landowner of farm and woodlands, we have lost half of the stock of trees to ash dieback. What help is there in the future to restock the woodlands across the southeast?
Well, Graham did touch on this earlier, but there is a plant health grant through the through the Forestry Commission, which should help with that.
Thank you. We've had various questions on devaluing land. So I won't go through all of those, but there's one question here. Food production on arable land is needed to increase our self-sufficiency again, and it produces an annual income and hopefully profit. Planting woodland will reduce the land value considerably. Woodland creation is very expensive, followed by maintenance costs with no return for many years. The economics do not tie up. Any comments on that?
I'll take that one first. I think it's a very good point, and we hear that a lot. I think the economics are changing though. And I think you're right, and this won't change. You know, tree planting is a very capital intensive business at the beginning, and they take a long time to grow, so the income doesn't really come for many, many years, and the thinning income is sometimes just doesn't cover the cost of doing it. But what's changing now is the carbon payments, and if you're able to secure an establishment grant to help you do that in the first place, but then access someone to buy the carbon credits of that woodland, then that changes the economics. And over time, the valuations of forestry land will build that in. And yeah, I think so it's kind of new thinking that hasn't perhaps fed all the way through to the valuation models as yet. And also bear in mind, nobody is saying plant up all your agricultural land with trees. Food production is absolutely key rural land use, and each landowner needs to take a view as to where and what land would be suitable for planting trees, and perhaps the more marginal land where the profits are more marginal is where to start.
Question here, how realistic is it to hope that land planted with trees planted for a crop can be returned to pasture after felling? Might there be an increased reward for continuous cover felling?
Well, a lot will depend on, going forward, what is built into the incentives regime. I think continuous cover is perhaps the ultimate in sustainable woodland management, but it's not a regime that can be achieved overnight. It takes a long time, and it's not for everybody. It doesn't suit all circumstances, it doesn't suit all people. But that should be part of the new support, incentive regime, I would say. In terms of how realistic it is, well, it's quite a tight spot, because as I said in the presentation, there is a good reason why we have the retention of woodland cover. But if we as a society are trying to get a lot more woodland for very good reasons, to tackle climate change, but also there's lots of other good reasons to have lots of woodland, then we perhaps need to think smarter about maybe some of the circumstances where that permanence might be acting as a barrier. And I've seen a couple of the questioners have raised that issue, and it's no surprise that they have. It might just need to be finessed a little bit rather than by government, rather than done away with.
Yeah, certainly something that comes up regularly with members' concern about planting trees. Stephen Penrose has asked, do apple orchards qualify for carbon credits?
They could do. They would probably sequester less in terms of, if you compared it to faster growing species, but trees are trees. And my advice to anybody in that situation would be to look at the species that you're planting, how many of them, and see what the carbon code models, what comes out of those in terms of the amount of carbon that you would sequester, and see whether it stacks up or not.
A question for Ollie here. Plastic tree protection for individual trees is not sustainable in the long term. What sustainable alternatives are there on the market?
Some of the manufacturers are starting to develop those tree shelters which photodegrade into small little bits, but they are still robust enough to last 5 to 7 years, enough to help the tree's establishment. Over the years, we have tried a sort of a cardboard or almost like a waxed paper mache type of tree shelter, but these haven't been very durable and have often only lasted a year or two. So I think it's going to be some mix between the two, something natural, but it's going to have to be hard wearing enough to make it worth using in the first place.
Thank you. We've got various questions on pest management, which clearly is a massive issue in this country. Deer and squirrel management is essential for establishing trees, as Ollie mentioned. How likely is it that schemes will contribute towards the cost of this, be it through professional contractors, qualified recreational stalkers, local people like shoots or volunteer groups like the various squirrel groups throughout the UK?
Yeah.
All I would say at the moment is that currently under countryside stewardship, squirrel and deer control are supported through higher tier the woodland management grant. But whether that's really enough in most or some circumstances, I'm not really sure. I don't know whether Graham's got anything further to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's the management payments if you can get them, but let's be honest, they're not high enough, and they probably don't last for as long as they need to. And those would be two things that would be one of our recommendations, is that if we want woodlands managed, existing woodlands managed, then we need to have some kind of realistic cash flow payment in order to effectively manage them. And if we're planting lots more woodlands, there is little point if we don't effectively manage them, and that includes deer control and squirrel control, because they can, as anybody who knows about this, they can absolutely undo lots of expensive, painstaking work in a very short space of time. So, but it would probably come in the form of a management grant, and it just needs, the quantum needs to be better.
So a follow-up from the question earlier on the management as part of the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme. Thank you for your response. Perhaps it would be better to ask what management regime gives the most carbon capture. Could it be, for example, that simply planting, protecting and leaving the woodland would give the best carbon capture?
Well, I suppose if you were doing a clear fill at the end, then you could argue that reduces the amount of ongoing carbon capture. And there is something in that. However, if that wood is then used in construction, then that carbon is still locked up in the wood, although it's maybe not sequestering carbon into the woodland soil if it's no longer woodland anymore. So I get the point. Perhaps woodland in perpetuity will sequester more, but they're not precise answers to these sorts of issues. But I think even if you harvest the wood, that is not necessarily a bad thing, because there are many other reasons why we need to plant trees. And wood is an absolutely fantastic material. It's amazing the things you can do with it. And if we can sequester that into buildings, yeah.
To follow up on that then, we've got a question about the end product for our woodlands and what is the realistic market beyond wood chip. This question says, it seems to me that the government banning firewood sales and not pressing ahead with its use in large buildings projects following Grenfell, that might result in much standing trees being left to rot and die, releasing the carbon stored, rather than it being harvested for a profit. Any thoughts on that in terms of the timber market?
I would just say that with regards to the, from any one tree, the amount of it that is cut to be burnt is very, very small. And as the UK imports over 80% of the timber it uses, we will always have a home for everything that we grow is burnt or chip.
There's a few people that have been asking about elms and saying that given that elms is not going to be available until at least the end of 2024 on a proper scale at least, should they be waiting until that point to plant trees, or should they be considering something now, and will they miss out if they do something in the interim?
Very understandable question. All I would say is that the government, we've asked them, and we've asked them repeatedly actually, and I think they're getting the message that maybe they need to repeat their assurance. But they gave an assurance last November, I think it was, Zach Goldsmith, the minister who's in charge of trees, gave an assurance that no one would be disadvantaged by going into a current scheme, given what comes down the track in 3 or 4 years' time from Elm. They've said that wouldn't disadvantage you, and we've said to them maybe they should repeat that assurance and give some of the mechanics of that. So we might hear more about that, but it shouldn't disadvantage you. I would say if you're thinking of planting trees, now is always the best time.
That's something that we are talking about constantly with DEFRA. I think when we're talking about the creation of elms for not just trees, but for all kinds of elm options. A question again about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme. I mean, there is more information on this in Graham's guidance notes, but when a price for carbon credits is agreed, are the payments made on an annual basis, or is it a lump sum for the term agreed, whether 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, you get a payment. It's not an annual payment. It's a payment every 5 or 10 years, and I believe you can decide whether you want it every 5 or 10 years. And also bear in mind, if an annual payment or even an upfront payment is more important to you, then selling on the open market can secure that. But of course, it always depends what price you can achieve on the open market. And I think the government's intention with this guarantee scheme, or one of them, is to try to bring the market price up and provide some kind of guarantee. And so far, it seems to be working. The average price from the first auction was £24 a tonne, which was significantly higher than the average price before that. We'll see how this thing progresses. But yeah, the guarantee scheme is a 5 or 10 yearly income, not an annual one.
I think that one of the things we haven't spoken about very much is the amenity value of woodland. Obviously, it's something that we are covering in the CLA strategy. Do you think that that is something that needs to be looked at more going forward?
Well, there's lots of different reasons why we need to plant trees. As I said, it's an absolutely fantastic product that comes from it, but there are all sorts of societal benefits from having trees in the landscape, whether it be from health and well-being, or food and drink, or materials, or all sorts. And there's room for all of it, really, as well as carbon. And we should perhaps, because there's so much noise about carbon, because it's a new and exciting thing, we shouldn't lose sight of the many other reasons why we should have trees, biodiversity, etc.
Great, thank you both. We've had some interesting questions there. There were lots and lots of questions coming up on the Q&A panel, so I'm sorry that we haven't got around to everyone's. But if there's something that you would like to discuss following this webinar, please do get in touch with your CLA regional office. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to our sponsors, Stretton Parker and Barclays. If there's anything else you would like to discuss further, please get in touch with your regional office, whether it's on forestry and woodland or if it's on anything else. Also, do have a look on the CLA website at the recent guidance notes, including the one on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme. You can log on to that via My CLA and access guidance notes by clicking on the drop-down box under Advice. Please look out for our forthcoming webinars. You can see what's coming up on the CLA website. You can also see recordings of all of the previous webinars. A recording of today will be up there in the next few days. Next week's webinar is on the topic of planning and development, and we'll look at how we can create a simplified planning system and whether the new white paper addresses these issues. The next In Conversation With event is with Professor Alistair Driver, Director of Rewilding Britain, on Friday the 12th of June. Thank you again for joining us.